So the title is Why Chemo Causes Drug Resistance. But in order for you to understand that, you have to understand really how life works. See, the problem with our biomedical industry, scientific, etc., today, is that we have a fundamental lack of understanding of what we're supposedly, experts in. The thing ultimately comes down to is we don't understand the origins of life. We don't understand how things really flow into the future. We're left in a world where we are the physics that should connect to our biology says that our biology is impossible because it's statistically too improbable to exist. But there's another field of physics that was developed by Nobel laureate Ilya Prigogine. He got his degree in 1947, the year I was born, and he got his Nobel Prize in 1977 for creating a new field of physics, far from equilibrium thermodynamics. And from the perspectives that are natural, when you understand that field, life must exist. So I've been following his work since I was in my 20s, which is when the genetic code was discovered. So I was a student and then an early postdoc when we were learning the most fundamental aspects of molecular biology and gene expression. And, it was wonderful. I was as indoctrinated as the most hardcore, fanatical scientist that I wind up encountering today about the righteousness of our scientific approach, etc. But there were a number of unanswered questions, like how did it all happen? And it can't have happened if it's impossible, so let's embrace this new physics and see where that leads us. And where it leads us is to what I want to talk to you about today, because it provides a foundation for us to understand from a physical perspective what life is, what we are, and where we should go. So the chemo story is part of all of that. And I start out now, I used to try to explain things from a more intellectual perspective as a start, but I now found that it's more effective if I gore you a little and shock you a little first. So what you're looking at here is this poor kid from Africa who's got xeroderma pigmentosum. Xeroderma pigmentosum is a genetic defect in nucleotide excision repair, which is one of the ways that your body generates protective mechanisms against sunlight and a variety of other types of DNA damage that come from things like carcinogens that are in cigarette smoke, for example, or cannabis smoke. There's a fundamental difference between cannabis smoke and cigarette smoke, though, but that's another story. I'll try not to get diverted. So what happens with xeroderma is you generate a variety of damages, mostly dimers, pyrimidine dimers, and a couple of other types of damages that can be highly mutagenic. And you develop cancer. Some people are so sensitive that if they're in fluorescent light, they get cancer, okay? And because the light penetrates the eye through the retina, it makes them blind. So this poor kid, you see over here, is this our projector? What do we have? What you can see in the lower picture there, that's the top of his head. He was covered with melanoma, and all he wanted to do was die. He was in so much pain, as you might imagine, looking at his lip. His tongue was like that as well. This is a young kid. He was 17, I think, at the time. And cannabis was smuggled into him, and he started to use cannabis. And the picture you see on the right up there, that's after about 1 year of cannabis application, not just topically, internally as well. And his tongue cleared up, and his head cleared up, and he was starting to see again, so he was starting to study. I have PTSD myself, so I cry when I tell this story. But he was studying and going so that he could go back to school because he was able to read again, and he was practicing the multiplication table. So this is an extreme effect of what cannabis can do. And if you think about it, how is this happening? How is cannabis able to functionally reverse a genetic disease? And this was quite a puzzle to me as well. Until I figured out how to integrate that into my way of thinking, this thermodynamic approach. So I'm going to show you a couple more of these little, but by the way, the government, this was in Zimbabwe, And the government recently sent a representative from the government health department to Canada to see if they could pave the way to get Donald into Canada for treatment. And that became too complicated, so now it looks like it's being brought back to him so he can start on his therapy again, because when he stopped, he significantly progressed worse. And there was a change of government and, you know, the normal nonsense of how people get screwed. So this is another man who also got screwed, ultimately. In the first picture up on the left there, it doesn't show up too good on that screen there. The guy had a huge bump on the top of his head with 3 deep holes that penetrated way down, and they would fill up with smelly fluid, and he would sleep on towels, and he was in terrible pain all the time, and he was on a lot of narcotics. And then he went to the doctors that wanted to cut off his tumor, but also cut off his skull and mount it under his skin so they could treat it in case the cancer metastasized to the bone. He said, "You're crazy, we're not doing that." He goes to another doctor, and that's shown on the upper right, but I don't want to deal with any messing around now and screw things up. What you can see, though, is on the top a very red head with a bunch of little nasties on it. They gave him 130 radiation treatments. This is criminal activity as far as I'm concerned. 130 times you did it before you figured out it doesn't work? If it takes that, then it's intrinsically wrong what you're doing. So the lower panel that you see over here, you can see that there's 2 main tumors, and then if you look in the back, there's a 3rd central one, okay? And those were what happened after we started to put cannabis on and smear cannabis on. We would illegally, mail him cannabis in the great land of the free, and he would put it on, and now he had a new oncologist again. And this guy says, "Wow, we have nothing in our armaments that can do what I'm seeing happening to this squamous cell cancer." And he said, "Put it all over his head. Let's see what happens." We don't know where the tumor is. So we put it all over his head, and he was open like that for a year as he continued to degrade the tumor mass. You can see there were really 3 of them, the 2 on the sides and then the one in the back. And he was on minimal narcotics, and he had no infections, except he ultimately wound up going to a hospital for something, and I don't remember what it was, but they gave him antibiotics to which he was allergic to, and he ultimately died in the hospital from medical treatment. This is another woman in Australia. It's actually 2 women in Australia, 2 sisters. By the way, Bosie, Jackie's sister, say hello to you. The nose there is from a friend, Jacqueline, who was here a couple of years ago with us. What you see up on, let's look here first. What you see here, and you can't really see it, it was that there was a small irritation in her nose. She had basal cell carcinoma. She had that a number of times. Her and her family are fair-skinned limeys living on a sugarcane farm in Australia saying, "Please give me skin cancer." And of course, nature obligates, obliges. So her sister, her mother, her father, her 2 sisters, and her 2 brothers, they all have skin cancer. So she had it repeatedly, and had some treated, and they left scars. So when I met her, I said, "Why don't you just try putting cannabis on? You're not going to get scars, and it'll go away." Which she did, and that's what the other pictures are, showing various progression until in the end here, she had a medical diagnosis, completely gone. So she was quite happy about that, and I'll get to a little turn in the road here. She came down with another one that looked the same. When they first, you just see this little redness. So she puts the cannabis on again, and she's removed a number of them on herself now. She just, puts it on, and you make the cancer go away. And this time, what you see is the cancer started to grow. I am freaking out. This was my girlfriend at the time. So I'm completely freaking out when it's starting to grow. We already knew, though, that when you first put cannabis on these squamous cell skin cancers, they start to grow, because the picture above that was her sister. So we knew that we had this problem, but Jackie's walking around with this marble on her nose for like 2 months, whereas the squamous cells fall off and disappear in anywhere from 3 to 4 days to maybe 2 weeks. The squamous cell, the one on the top there, that was on her arm for a couple of months as it grew and grew before it finally collapsed. So I'm freaking out that she's walking around with this beast growing on her nose. And in that picture right there, the second from the end, if you had a better view, you could see that it was really swollen up. It like had pressure in it, you know? And I'm saying, we can't deal with this anymore. So my whole way of thinking has to do with metabolism and the way everything in your body is regulated ultimately. When homeostasis is discussed, how does homeostasis occur? It occurs because ultimately the free radicals that are produced in so many different places under different circumstances modify other actors, which then change how they function, so that you wind up with this psychedelic harmony in biochemistry. It's all about flow and modifying the flow to adapt. So I said, well, we got to overload these cancer cells with free radicals. Take some hydrogen peroxide, put it on a cotton ball, and hold it on there and see what happens. So she did that, and again, I'm sorry you can't see it better, but in that picture there, you can see it starting to shrivel up. That happened within an hour of putting the hydrogen peroxide on. And then it progressively went away. No scar after, despite the monster, and the same is true with her sister, despite the monster. So squamous cells are easy and they're kind of nice because what they show you is they show you what's happening inside. Here we have two possibilities. One cell type that responded very nicely and quickly and died with the basal cell, and the other which was nourished by the cannabis to a degree until whatever was exactly occurring finally allowed the whole mess, the little monster as we called it, to fall off and disappear. She doesn't even have a scar. I made these slides a long time ago. There's nothing there. You can't even tell she had the monster growing on her. So why is all of this happening? I transformed from Keystone to PowerPoint, and it doesn't quite look like it liked it all. So we've heard a lot about balance today, but what is really being balanced? What's being balanced is free radical damage with preventing free radical damage. And a key concept that has to be kept in mind is that all living systems can only maintain their organization, which is what characterizes life, as long as energy flows. A key take-home message from Prigoghine's work is that flowing energy organizes matter. And when flowing energy has organized matter for 4.5 billion years, the matter can sit here and have a conference. It's just a natural product of evolution and flowing energy literally pushing creativity. And we will see how far we can get into what that means on a molecular level. But the idea here is that free radicals are what need to be balanced, and that on the level of sugar carbohydrate metabolism, which might be what is said underneath that thing that I can't quite read, you have the electron transport system balancing aerobic glycolysis as one of the balancing acts that are occurring. What does that mean that it's balancing? Well, the electron transport system is the very efficient way of making energy, meaning ATP. That's the common currency of all cells. It's like a dollar bill. You want to build something, you have enough bucks, you go and do it. You have enough ATP, you go and do it. Same story, all right? So what you have to do is make all of that ATP, but the most efficient way of making it happens to be very dangerous. You just heard the story of the mitochondria. So the mitochondria have a number of functions, and the one that is most touted and well known is the electron transport system, because it is the efficient way of making energy. You put in 1 molecule of glucose and you get out, around 36 molecules of ATP. So that's the efficient mode. But while you're doing that, the electron transport system leaks, and it leaks free radicals. And that's now a perfect analogy with a nuclear reactor, because when you have living tissues hit by radiation, radiation splits the water and makes free radicals. So that's the same free radicals, the same type actually, that are produced in various metabolic functionalities, especially coming out of the electron transport system, again, which is the major source of killing. So let's look at a couple of numbers that will blow your mind a little bit, but will kind of give more support for the direction that I want to go in. Every one of us has about 15, 20, 30 trillion cells in your body. And the standard line, which I believe is true, I'm not going to dispute our current way of looking at things. I want to extend it. And I beg of anybody who is involved in cancer research, etc., to speak with me and explore this different way of looking at things, because I've convinced myself, and I'm a huge skeptic, especially of myself, but I have 28,000 peer-reviewed articles that I've used to create and to verify what I'm talking about, so I can very thoroughly document everything that I'm talking about. So it turns out that the conventional view is that one free radical molecule could damage the DNA in a critical gene, like an oncogene or an anti-tumor suppressor gene, an anti-cancer gene, and if it knocked that gene out or activated that gene, depending on the circumstance, you would now generate a cancer. So if the antioxidant systems of your body didn't quench the free radical before it, say, interacted with that gene, then the next step would be for protection would be for your DNA repair systems to recognize the modified DNA, chop it out, and fix it. Similar to what we talked about with the sunlight, but there's a different system. Instead of nucleotide precision repair for big chunks like ultraviolet damage, there's another thing called base excision repair. Again, showing you how important DNA repair and genetic maintenance is. But I want to show you that genetic maintenance occurs under defined conditions, and in contrast, the opposite occurs under other conditions. You know, if you need innovation to survive, well, then you've got to modify what you have, not just try to restore what you had, because that's not working, right? So it turns out that our cells have that intrinsic ability, and we'll go into it a little bit more, but basically what I'm telling you is that when a cell is happy, and the energy is flowing in, and it's doing whatever it's supposed to do, it could be a cell doing nothing, in which case very little energy is flowing, or it could be a cell that's involved in your nervous system, and in integrating your nervous system. So what we want to be able to do ultimately is see the common denominators among all cells in terms of energy flow, and what's responsible for creating damages and how the cells fix those damages. So again, back to some crazy numbers. You know, from a probabilistic point of view, like a static point of view, which is what I'm against looking at, okay? But so we can see the absurdity of being embedded in that way of thinking. The physics that underlies the biology that we accept as normal, that physics says that life can't exist. So doesn't it make sense that we have to look somewhere else? So when you look at living systems and energy flowing through those systems, that is the critical factor. And it turns out that not only is endocannabinoid system in the American schools barely now starting to be taught, but with a very restrictive perspective. The dogma, so to speak, is what you're hearing, not from me. But that dogma, again, is successful in a certain way, but it leaves open a million questions, starting with what is life? So the reason I keep going down this path is, think about it for a second. Would you bring your car to a mechanic who didn't know how a car worked? You know, suppose you had this brand new car and it had no gas in it, and you went in there and you went to turn it on and nothing happened. You couldn't start it. Well, if you didn't understand how a car worked, you might start replacing this part of that part of this part of that part. Ultimately, the car can't move without fuel. The same is true of your cells. They can't live without fuel because the fuel provides the flow. It's the flow of mass and the flow of energy that sustains the organization of life. And it turns out that there's a very fundamental balancing act that occurs, because as we make energy efficiently with the little nuclear reactor in our mitochondria, and we create this radiation equivalent damage, we've got to be able to balance that so we don't just have our cells undergo apoptosis. And all apoptosis, no matter, there's different routes, you know, because we like to organize things. Ultimately, they all come down to excess free radical production. And let me point out at this point that we need free radicals, because those are what do the damages that signal the holistic system that it needs to make alterations. Specific alterations wherever you're getting this excess of damages. So, back again to this balancing act. What we are not taught, have not been taught in general, do not teach in general, to any significant degree, is nutrition and diet in medical school. And it turns out that while both carbohydrates and fats serve as our predominant source of fuel, our main energy sources, they're not equivalent. They're not equivalent at all. Okay, the nuclear reactor of the electron transport system is all powered by carbohydrate metabolism. And as it makes all these good things, you know, functional kidney, functional neurons, all that wonderful stuff, it also makes these damages that have to be repaired. And what happens with a cancer cell, it's so imbalanced that it winds up focusing its flow for survival into cell division instead of acting in homeostatic control, okay? So the other side of this story is that when cells burn fat, they burn energy, they make energy inefficiently, but they make it safely. Well, let me back up here. Let's go back to I forgot which balancing act I was on. We're looking at aerobic glycolysis now. So how does aerobic glycolysis protect the cell from excess free radical damage? Aerobic glycolysis, you know, normally if you're going to burn with the electron transport system sugar, right? So you got 6 carbons, and it breaks down and it makes 6 CO2s, carbon dioxide, right? Well, there are alternative things that can happen. It doesn't have to break the whole thing down all the way. It breaks it down partially, releasing 1 CO2 or 2 CO2s, and it winds up producing lactic acid. Now, so that means a lot of energy still in that lactic acid, but also lactic acid is an acid. So you hear all the time, especially in the popular literature, but also in the scientific literature, about how cancer likes acid and likes sugar. Well, of course it likes sugar, because sugar is what fuels aerobic glycolysis. We're all familiar with more of anaerobic glycolysis, all right? You add your yeast and your malt and you make beer, but if you can't have too much oxygen there, or you won't make the alcohol. So when you don't have enough oxygen, you make the alcohol. This is the same situation, but the oxygen is there. The pathways are redirected because of the free radical damage signaling to all of the molecules throughout the cell to holistically function in a fashion to change things. So you wind up having a balance between the sugar burning safely via aerobic glycolysis, more safely, versus the electron transport system. But that's only one aspect of how cells will try to protect themselves. They can make things. So this mode, here you see that we have fat production occurring, fiber production, cell division, migration. The energy is very usable. And one of the mind-blowing things, and this goes back to really the title of the talk, is that because of what I'm telling you, because the aerobic glycolysis is safer and is not going to generate as many free radicals, it turns out, you know, the cells figured that out as well. So it turns out that when cells are replicating their DNA, they shut down the electron transport system, okay? Now, why is that of significance? Normally the DNA is all wrapped up. You've got in every one of your cells about 2 meters worth of DNA, and your cell is so small you can't see it. So it turns out if you took those 15 trillion the DNA from those 15 trillion cells and stretched it out, it would go from here to the sun and back a few hundred times. That's a mind-blowing statistic to me, at least. And in a similar vein, if you look, the probability of DNA coming out of a dye tumbler of its components, just hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, you throw it in there and poof, DNA. That's not going to happen. That's why the static view, which is what statistics static, right? The static view is not appropriate because life would not be here. But we are all here. So again, we have to look at how this flow creates organization and how the organization is homeostatic and how there are multiple levels of what that means. So let's look at a large macroscopic level. We have our immune system and we have our sensory system, our nervous system, okay? Those are the two systems that interact with our environment that provide the flow. Your immune system and your nervous system say, oh, I'm hungry, go eat. The rest is just mechanics, but the organization and the functionality comes from those two things because what they're doing, the immune system is protecting you from all the mass that comes in, be it the food you eat or the mosquito bite or the virus that you inhale. And in contrast, where was I? The nervous system monitors all the information that comes in. So all of your senses are simply measurements, Now, when cells communicate with their environment, they do it with various receptors. So think of the receptors of a cell as the ears of a cell. And instead of information coming in as sound pulses, it's coming in as chemicals that are activating the downstream. Because the downstream is common, it's the nerve transmission, right? So what we want to be able to do is see how the nervous system and the immune system are regulated by cannabinoids and what are they really doing there. So I want to just make the statement right up front so there's no ambiguity, because all of the dialogue that I hear about the function of this receptor and the function of that receptor and CB1 and CB2 and the amount of CB1 and TH ratio, to me that's all nonsense. Just all it's intellectually fun, Our drug development industry is great for one thing, education. It's terrible for trying to give people chemicals that they should be eating because they don't fit into the flow of how you were created. They become perturbations in that flow. That's why they always have side effects. Plus, they were designed not based on an intellectual foundation of understanding how you work. They're based on how do we relieve the symptoms that you have. Well, if you don't correct the underlying cause, well, that's a great market because you're going to keep taking the drug that relieves the symptoms while you keep screwing yourself more and more because you haven't fixed the problem. So we see that occurring on and on. Back to drug resistance. Cancer cells turn off the electron transport system during S phase, which means that they can't amplify the damages in the mitochondria, amplified by making more and more free radicals that would then trigger apoptosis, okay? So you can't do that as easily. So let me go to the next slide here and see. What we see is that there are layers of this balancing act. Some stuff is not coming through here. Or it didn't come through. So what we're looking at here, again, is not only carbohydrate metabolism balanced between sugar, aerobic glycolysis and the mitochondria, but now we're looking at, on the one side, both of those things are on this side within that arrow, and on the other side of the balancing act now is fat burning. And the fat burning is so critical because what it does is it recycles. It's basically what's called autophagy, autophagy, self-eating. But it doesn't just randomly eat itself. It eats its problems. It eats its damages and then fixes them. And in the process, it provides all of the components that the cell needs in order to be a cell and to grow and divide or do whatever it's supposed to do. So recycling is what's turned on by fat burning and autophagy. And if you balance fat burning with doing things, now we're talking on an organismic level, okay? If you balance fat burning with doing things, meaning carbohydrate metabolism, and you properly balance that, then you don't produce excess free radicals. Well, excess free radicals, not in a static sense, but in the dynamic sense of how they affect the flow, is what underlies all illnesses and the aging process. So the question that stumped me for a long time, there are some physical examples that are not living that describe flow-dependent structures, and I think we have some of them I can show you. But yeah, let's look for some of them. So these didn't come across right at all with the translation, sorry, but that just shows the stacking, like Paul's triangles, but these are all flowing triangles, not just balanced. They're dynamically balanced, because life is all dynamic. This is a good point to go into and really, hopefully, be clear enough, which I often am not, to show you what's going on in the flow of energy and life and metabolism and its relationship to cancer and blah, blah, blah. This is online. It's online in a somewhat better version. I have an animated version where I talk and explain it. I was very stoned and it was in the middle of the night, but it gets the points across. So let's consider stem cells. What are stem cells? They're cells that can become other things, right? Turn into from something that's undifferentiated into something that's differentiated. So right there, from what I've told you, undifferentiated, it doesn't need a lot of energy. It doesn't need efficient energy. Differentiated, it needs the efficient energy. So let's start. Do I have a pointer here? Is this a pointer or not? This must be a pointer. Yes. No, it doesn't show anything, does it? Huh. Oh, there we go. You can see that? All right. So let's... Oops. All right. Fat fingers. Now to find it again. All right, there we go. So here are the two... here's our energy source, right? Cellular energy flow. And you see that we have the electron transport system, carbohydrate burning, and then we have aerobic glycolysis and glutaminolysis, all coming out of this. And I made it look like a piece of toast because it's all carbohydrate metabolism. And this is efficient but dangerous. So that's why you see what we have here is a balance between the little nuclear reactor, which would be the electron transport system, versus the Bunsen burner, which would be less efficient at making energy, but safer, okay? And what you see is when the cell starts out, when you start out with a cancer cell, with a stem cell down here, embryonic stem cell, that stem cell is burning fat. Why is that significant? Because it means it's not making free radicals, it's not aging. You want your stem cells to be as old as you are, meaning having gone through all that replication and error accumulation, or would you rather they sat there waiting for when you need them, and then having your body and the holistic nature of communication within the body say, hey, stem cells, we need more of you, and we need you to turn into new neurons, for example, which is what the CB1 receptor does. Why does the CB1 receptor do that? Because it regulates the electron transport system. The CB1 receptor regulates a number of channels, including calcium channels, and what is a universal truth is that the universal truth is that calcium channels are involved in activation. That probably comes from the primordial soup. Before we had DNA, we had flow-dependent chemical reactions that generated complexity in the oceans and in little puddles, etc., where you had localization of chemicals. Instead of taking a spoon of sugar and putting it in the water and stirring it up and having the water all taste the same, imagine that you put it in the water and you taste the water here and you taste the water there, and there are only certain spots that are sweet. The rest of it's not sweet. That's what happens. That's what flow-dependent structures do. They organize matter. And the other thing they do is they do that with pulsation, and it always occurs a balance between opposing forces. When energy flows and creates organization, it does so creating waves, essentially one side, the other side, one side, the other side. And we see that throughout our body. We see that in our heart rate. We see that in our breathing. We see that in menstrual cycles. We see that ultimately all keyed in with our diurnal cycles. So all of our biochemistry is pulsating and talking with all the pieces within it and having a dialogue with aerobic metabolism, with glutaminolysis, which is another source to feed into these energy flows, with the electron transport system, and then with fat burning. Fat burning also occurs in the mitochondria and is turned on by what? Guess what turns it on? Polyunsaturated fatty acids. And guess what those fatty acids are made into? Your endocannabinoids. So you make endocannabinoids out of omega-3s and out of omega-6s. The difference between those two is that omega-6s work in the sugar-burning mode, whereas the omega-3s turn on the fat-burning mode. So omega-3s, you still are dealing with inflammation. You know, it turns out that, for example, cyclooxygenase, that's what aspirin inhibits, okay? That's created from arachidonic acid. And that can all be modulated. Your cannabinoids are one of those products. All right, aspirin inhibits COX 1 and 2. They made a new pharmaceutical improvement on aspirin, which only affected COX 2, because COX 1 happens to work different products and actually stabilizes your stomach. So when people take too much aspirin, they wind up with ulcers. So an enzyme, a pharmaceutical was developed that would specifically only inhibit COX-2 and therefore alter the arachidonic cascade that makes a whole bunch of prostaglandins and heats and a bunch of things, all right? A bunch of chemical categories that are meaningful to people who are into all of that. The bottom line, though, some of them are endocannabinoids, and what the endocannabinoids do is they turn on protective prostamides, which are a new class, basically, of chemicals that are similar to prostaglandins, but they turn, typically, the chemically structure is different, but they, in many cases, are anti-inflammatory. Cannabis, in general, is anti-inflammatory. Potential danger, and you hear this alluded to in different ways, but without the underlying foundation, is how come sometimes it looks like cannabis is supporting a cancer? Well, if the cancer is using the electron transport system and CB1 activity is facilitating that in low doses, like getting high, then you're going to actually promote that cancer. You need high doses of cannabis, and you need to turn on the CB2 receptor, because that's the one that turns on the fat burning, and when you have virgin cancer cells, they can't biochemically shift. They wind up making too many free radicals and they die. So back to this picture here. So your adult stem cells start out as fat burners, and then as they get told by their environment, hey, do something, you know, become a baby, for example. Because the ultimate stem cell, I guess, would be the zygote, right? But I don't think that burns fat, but I don't know that. So anyway, as the cell goes to do something, it undergoes what's called the EMT transition. At this point here, this is different states of differentiation, essentially, all right? Your skin, right, is a final product. And your skin is kind of weird because your skin is meant to die. But your skin turns over every 10 or 14 days. So that's a terminal differentiation product. So it's going to have its own characteristics, and you know what's good or bad for it is going to be different than a cell that has to replicate all the time forever to keep making you a stomach lining. We have all different needs which are going to represent different gene expressions and different, manifestations, but they will all always be powered by either sugar, fat, or on rare occasions like when you're starving, proteins. So we undergo this transition because now we are making energy a little bit more efficiently, and we're doing it no longer from within. We're doing it by communicating more from without to the cell, to the environment. So that stem cell becomes mobile. That's an easy thing, think of an amoeba, right? It can crawl around. So that ultimately then, the next step would be for that cell to find a home, an environment that matches up with its inputs and outputs, right? And then you have your healthy differentiated cell. But for various reasons, it could get alterations, metabolically, sunlight, poison in your food, poison in your water, poison in your air, poison in your pharmaceuticals, and you then wind up going backwards because the free radicals, instead of doing what they should do in balance, are now the cell has to protect itself. So it's going to turn off its differentiated functions. And the first, on the way back down, is it's going to now become a cancer cell. And it can metastasize because when it uses the glycolysis, it expresses different genes and has different communication, still within that carbohydrate burning mode. All right? But if you keep screwing with it, imagine you're a cancer cell, all right? And I want to get rid of you. So if I go and I start beating you up all the time, you're going to be bruised and damaged even more, and you're going to say, you know what, I'm going to move. I'm going to get out of this town. They don't like me. I'm going to find a better home, and I'm going to raise a family. So they metastasize, and when they find a nice home, then they raise a family. Now, when you continue to assault them, they have nowhere to go because they've already done that. So now what they do is they basically hibernate. They stop communicating with the environment. They now have become a de-differentiated cancer cell. That is burning fat. But often what happens is, you see, the flow has to always be maintained. So when you go and you treat with chemo, what you wind up doing is you wind up selecting for metabolic states. So cell cycle has a variety of production area. Make DNA would be another one. First, make everything you need to make whatever you need to make 2 cells, including DNA. Then replicate your DNA. Then clean up everything, and now the cell can divide. So that's your cell cycle, okay? And what I'm saying is that every aspect of that cell cycle is regulated by free radicals and the damages and how they influence the flow. So, when you have, in this ultimate case here, you turn on a fat-burning cancer, but you keep screwing with that one as well. The metabolism is still alive in these cells. The DNA is not compatible with replication and survival. But the DNA is still sitting there, and the metabolism keeps generating damages. And those damages are repaired by different mechanisms. So in a normal cell, in a differentiated cell, it's going to make a whole bunch of repair enzymes, base excision repair enzymes, that will see the damages, chop them out, and fix it. So now you maintain genetic integrity. That all happens in the sugar-burning mode. It blew my mind. We did experiments when I moved to Colorado years ago. I was the chairman of the bio department there, and I taught the world's only course on endocannabinoids and medical marijuana, and Colorado legalized. There was a connection there, believe me. But where was I going? See, this is the problem, short-term memory. I've got the world's worst, and it's always been that way. I think people with bad short-term memory like cannabis even more because it is very compatible with the way they think, because you don't think the same if you have short-term, because that's what being stoned does. So I'm always naturally stoned, and I had to learn how to function in that format because I have no short-term memory. I'm like an idiot. But I jump around and I learn all of this stuff, so while other people are microscoping down, I'm microscoping and jumping, microscoping and jumping. We out of time? Okay, let me punch real quick here, see what we're missing. These are flow-dependent structures, all right? These are molecules organizing themselves that should be impossible by statistics, but they happen all the time. Think of your toilet bowl when you flush it. That circle is millions, trillions, zillions of molecules organizing itself. Why? Flow of energy, gravity dissipated. So life is a natural process caused by flowing energy. We went over all of this. Illnesses are all metabolic. The endocannabinoid system controls everything, everywhere. CB2 is fat burning, CB1 is sugar burning. This lady died at 122. How'd you live so long? Smoking ganja. We live in a DNA-centric world. I didn't get to the critical points here, but in reality, from what I know, we all really should be in a metabolic-centric world, that the DNA is modified and created by the metabolism, and that's how these cancer cells progress, all done by metabolism. This is a Serbian friend who has MS. He's 100% disabled. And I don't know if we'll get this to play or not, but you can see him skipping rope and jumping down the stairs. This is my 83-year-old retired Romanian physician. Alzheimer's, he was a vegetable. Now he dances with the staff. I'll shut up. It affects everything, and you can reverse things. That's the key to remember. By changing the metabolism, by activating stem cells, psychoactive cannabinoids are in mother's milk. Why? Give the baby some neuroprotection. It's breathing oxygen. It's going to use the electron transport system. It's going to make free radicals. Relax the kid. Give it endocannabinoids and other goodies. Make them happy. You ever see, you breastfeed these babies, they got big fat cheeks and they're sleeping with such happiness, because you got them stoned. Jeez. But it's illegal. So should we arrest all women for walking around with paraphernalia? Free radicals are the friction of life. The oldest people in the world, I think Lemire mentioned them. This is the status of our civilization today, unfortunately. And this is what I hope will happen, and it is happening. The cannabis awakening is unstoppable. Too late for the idiots.
Ok, imamo kakšno vprašanje za Roberta Melameda, ta čas, dokler še se pol vrne v dvorano. Prosim, roko. Ja, tu je vprašanje. Mikrofon, mlada dama.
I will ask in Slovenian because it's easier for me. Bom vprašala v slovenščini in ker mlada dama ni več tako mlada, prehaja v zrela leta in bi tukaj navezala zadevo, kako prehaja v času mene, oziroma ko v nekem normalnem biološkem ciklusu se zmanjšajo nekatere snovi v telesu. Skratka, moje vprašanje je, kakšna je povezava biološkega ženskega ciklusa in endokannabinoidnega sistema. Hvala.
Yeah, again, the cannabinoid system regulates everything in your body. So, what do I have wrong here? It's so loud, though. Oh, it's coming through here too loud. Okay. All right. What happened? First, let's look at the menstrual cycle. Okay. Prior to ovulation, estrogen levels are high. The key to figuring out what chemicals do what is to take whatever you're interested in and look up, like in PubMed, its relationship with AMP kinase. AMP kinase is kind of the master regulator of whether you turn on fat burning. And in doing so, it turns off the sugar burning, and it turns off other things like aerobic glycolysis and VEGF, so it inhibits vascularization of tumors. All the things you want to happen when you turn these things, when you manipulate these things correctly. But it turns out that at ovulation, the estrogen levels drop, and estrogen, it turns out, turns on fat burning via this AMP kinase. You can see that. So that means it's protective, and it's recycling your damaged pieces, which is why women historically have lived longer. And what then happens is, in order to have implantation occur, you need to have an inflammatory environment. So the endocannabinoid anandamide, which is very highly produced in the uterus and in the female reproductive system and the male reproductive system and everywhere else, but in particular, because it's going to, you have to turn on the sugar burning to have the inflammatory biochemistry in order to have implantation. And similarly, when the sperm is wiggling its way to find that happy egg, it's got to wiggle that tail a lot. So the sperm is burning tons of energy using the mitochondria so that it can get to the egg. And when it gets to the egg, it's got to penetrate the egg by the acrosome reaction. And that's all clustered with mitochondria and ATP generation. But think about what happened. All of the mitochondria inside of the sperm got labeled with free radical damage. And then it gets into the egg, and the egg eats up all of the free radical damage, so now you have the reason for matrilineal inheritance. But going back then to estrogen, we now at least mentioned that estrogen fat burning. Well, when a woman goes into menopause, she loses her cycle because she's lost estrogen production, which means that she's not recycling as much. So what do you see happening to women once they've gone through menopause? They get osteoporosis, they have higher levels of cardiovascular disease, they cognitive dysfunction, they become like men, functionally, in terms of their susceptibility to these illnesses. So hormone replacements will then balance out fat burning some more, but cannabinoids do that as well. The other thing that's very important to understand, some of these trivial points, is that, you know, people, for example, if you have osteoporosis, what does that mean? It means that your bones are being degraded at a more rapid rate than they're being replaced. You replace your bones, your skeletal system, once about every 10 years. It's not like your skin, okay? And the idea is not to have the bone die in the end, you know, you want to keep it there. But it turns out that bone deposition only occurs during fat burning. And the osteoclasts, the specific cells that eat up your bone, they're produced during sugar burning. So it's very important for women when they, for women to turn on fat burning in order to protect themselves from the loss of estrogen.
Hvala.